Thunder rolled across the endless prairie, echoing like a distant drumbeat of war. Harriet's swollen belly tightened with each rumble as she clutched the reins, guiding the rickety wagon over the wind-swept plains. The promise of new life should have filled her heart with hope, but all she felt was dread. Her in-laws had made it brutally clear they wanted an heir, a strong boy to carry on the family name. Anything less would be seen as a betrayal of their dreams, and Harriet knew their wrath was far deadlier than any prairie storm. In that moment, she realized her survival and her unborn children's future hung in the balance. Harriet Owens was born in the bustling city of St. Louis, where steamboats chugged along the Mississippi and narrow streets were choked with crowds of all trades, dockworkers, merchants, and drifters alike. She grew up in a modest boarding house her mother ran after her father's death. Life in the city was never simple, but Harriet was no stranger to hard work. She was used to the clang of pots in the kitchen and the endless chores that came with housing strangers under her family's roof. When her path crossed with Samuel Brody, a dreamer and adventurer, passing through St. Louis on his way to claim farmland in the Western Territories, Harriet believed fate had intervened. Samuel was tall, broad-shouldered, and spoke in excited tones of the riches hidden in the fertile valleys beyond the Missouri River. Captivated by his vision and the opportunity for a life beyond her mother's boarding house, Harriet fell in love. It wasn't long before they wed in a small candlelit ceremony. With a handful of borrowed coins in their pockets and a second-hand wagon loaded with everything they owned, they set off along the Oregon Trail. Harriet imagined a life of new beginnings, peaceful sunsets, and a quiet homestead far from the noisy streets of her childhood. Little did she know that the perilous journey west would be nothing compared to the trials awaiting her once they arrived at the Brody Ranch. Their final stop was the dusty frontier town of Bristol's Fork. It was just a scattering of buildings, an old saloon, a blacksmith shop, a general store, a modest church, and a few houses huddled together near a small creek. Samuel pointed proudly to a stretch of land on the outskirts. This was where the Brody homestead would one day flourish. On the day Harriet first met her in-laws, John and Clara Brody, a cold wind cut across the yard. John had a severe expression etched into his sun-scorched face, and his grey eyes seemed to pierce right through her. Clara was silent, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Harriet greeted them with a respectful smile, but neither in-law so much as lifted their lips in return. They examined Harriet as if she were livestock, appraising her shoulders, her posture, even the strength of her handshake. "Is this the girl?" John asked, ignoring Harriet's presence and addressing Samuel directly. Harriet's heart sank. After all the hardships of the trail, she had hoped for a warm welcome, a new family to replace the one she'd left behind. Instead, she felt strangely judged, almost threatened by the silent disapproval in their eyes. Yet Harriet tried to stay optimistic. She reminded herself that frontier living was harsh, and many families turned hard and stoic over time. This was just the beginning. Perhaps in due course, they would come to accept her. She silently vowed to prove her worth. Life on the Brody Ranch was demanding from the start. Harriet rose before dawn to gather water from the well, feed the chickens, and help Clara in the kitchen. The older woman rarely spoke, except to give terse instructions how to properly slice bread or knead dough. Harriet sensed she was being tested at every moment, as though Clara anticipated she would fail. Meanwhile, John barked orders to both Harriet and Samuel. He wanted fences mended, fields, tilled the barn repaired, and 100 other chores completed. Samuel was confident, eager to demonstrate his abilities, but Harriet noticed the weight of his father's expectations pressed heavily on him. Each time John scolded him for a minor mistake, a dark cloud passed over Samuel's face. At first, Harriet tried to build camaraderie. She offered to help with heavier chores, even though her frame was slighter. She learned to swing a hammer haul feed and saddle the horses. She also discovered that her father-in-law was a stern believer in tradition. He insisted that a man's role was in the fields and that a woman should remain in the kitchen. Harriet's willingness to cross these boundaries unsettled him. She was expected to bear children and manage domestic tasks no more. Clara was less vocal but equally watchful. One day, Harriet found her quietly inspecting Harriet's sewing, running her bony fingers over the uneven stitches. There was no warmth in Clara's face, only a silent, unspoken judgment that Harriet had come to know all too well. Despite the tense atmosphere in the house, Harriet found moments of peace whenever she could steal away to the fields at sundown. She watched the skies burn orange and crimson over the rolling hills. In these private interludes, Harriet sometimes managed to coax a gentle conversation out of Samuel. He confided how he had grown up idolizing his father, wanting nothing more than to earn his respect. Yet John always seemed to find fault, and for all his talk of continuing the family name, he offered precious little praise. One evening, Harriet and Samuel strolled beyond the ranch's perimeter, past the weathered fence. They sat under a lone cottonwood tree, its leaves whispering in the breeze. Harriet placed her hand on Samuel's and spoke of her hopes. One day she wanted to see the ranch flourish, maybe build a schoolhouse in the town for the children who would inevitably come. She confessed how lonely it felt being judged by a family she desperately wanted to love. Samuel's eyes glimmered with empathy. "I promise Harriet things will be different once I prove my worth to Pa. Just a little while longer, and we'll have our own house, our own life," he said, pressing a reassuring kiss to her forehead. In that moment, Harriet felt a surge of optimism, imagining how the ranch might eventually transform into a loving home where in-laws, grandchildren, and dreams could thrive in harmony. As the seasons passed, Harriet discovered she was with child. Though a hint of concern flickered in her mind, given her in-laws' stony attitudes, she couldn't help feeling thrilled at the prospect of bringing a new life into the rugged frontier. She hoped the baby might finally soften John and Clara's hearts, give them something to celebrate together. But as Harriet's belly grew, the tension in the household seemed to worsen. Clara insisted on old remedies and strict bed rest, while Harriet wanted to remain active. She felt stifled by the watchful eyes that seemed more suspicious than supportive. She was carrying the future generation of Brodys, yet no one smiled. No one glowed with anticipation. When her time came, Harriet went into labor under the flickering light of lanterns. The local midwife, Martha Reynolds, a woman with sun-browned skin and a warm demeanor, arrived late in the night. She tried to comfort Harriet, who sobbed through the waves of pain, longing for her mother's reassuring presence. Samuel hovered by her side, clearly out of his depth, but trying to be strong. After hours of agonizing labor, Harriet gave a final push and heard the wail of a newborn. Relief and joy flooded her as she held a baby girl. Then unexpectedly another wave of contractions overtook her. Before anyone could react, Harriet birthed a second child. Another girl. She had twins. 2 perfect, squalling baby girls. But the celebration in Harriet's heart was met with a cold, thunderous silence in the rest of the house. A hush fell over the room the moment the midwife announced the second baby was also a girl. Harriet pressed both infants to her chest, tears of happiness clouding her eyes. The midwife offered a gentle smile, congratulating her on 2 healthy daughters. Only Samuel mustered an attempt at excitement, though his worry was evident. He glanced toward the closed door, behind which John and Clara stood unspeaking. At dawn, Harriet woke to find Clara near her bedside, staring at the sleeping infants. "Two girls," Clara murmured, not quite a question, more an indictment. Her expression carried a strange coldness, as though Harriet had committed some crime. A short while later, John burst in, ignoring Harriet's drawn face and the whimpering babies. He barked at Samuel and demanded that he fix the situation. "What do you mean?" Pa Samuel asked, voice trembling. John scowled, fists balled at his sides. "Two girls," he snarled. "No rightful heir, no continuation of our name. Just a drain on resources." "This is not what I planned." Every fiber in Harriet's body tensed. She had expected maybe disappointment from John and Clara, but nothing so cruel, so heartlessly venomous. The midwife, sensing the danger and confusion, quietly excused herself, telling Harriet she'd come check on her later. Even in her exhausted state, Harriet understood the reality in the eyes of her in-laws giving birth to daughters was an unforgivable sin. In the following days, Harriet struggled to care for the newborns while recovering from the difficult labor. She wanted to name them Mary and Martha after her beloved mother and the supportive midwife, but John forbade it. "You'll not name those girls after decent folk," he spat, as though Harriet's children were an abomination. Samuel tried to stand up to his father, but John roared for silence. Clara hovered in the background, lips a thin line, saying nothing in Harriet's defense. From whispered conversations overheard near the barn, Harriet learned the depth of her in-laws' fury. They had pinned great hopes on the baby being a boy, someone to inherit the ranch and fulfill John's dream of a grand Brodie legacy. Now they viewed Harriet as a failure, an obstacle. John's vile words suggested more than just disappointment. He cursed Harriet under his breath, said that a woman who couldn't produce a male heir had no place in his house. Harriet, heart-pounding, realized that with every passing day, her life and the lives of her daughters were in grave danger. Samuel, torn between his father's iron will and his wife's well-being, began to crumble. He seemed paralyzed, unable to fully protect Harriet from John's escalating rage. Each time Harriet pleaded with him to intervene, his eyes filled with shame. "I'm trying," he would mumble, though Harriet saw how John's power overshadowed him. She began to question if there was any escape from this suffocating, perilous situation. Late one evening, when the lanterns in the house were extinguished and the coyotes howled in the distance, Harriet finally confided in the midwife, Martha Reynolds. Harriet had hobbled out to the Porch twins, swaddled in her arms, while Martha checked on them under the faint light of the moon. Harriet spoke in hushed tones about John's threats and the horrifying possibility that he might take more drastic action if she remained under his roof. Martha's warm, calloused hand gripped Harriet's shoulder. "You must leave," Martha whispered urgently. She shared rumors she'd heard around Bristol's Fork. John Brodie's obsession with having a male heir was widely known. In the past, he had turned away orphan girls in need of a place to stay, refusing to help unless they contributed to the Brodie legacy. Martha believed John was capable of extreme measures if it meant securing his twisted vision of a future for the ranch. "But where can I go?" Harriet asked, tears brimming. She had no money, no family in the West, and barely the strength to walk more than a few steps without wincing from labor pains. The thought of traveling alone with two newborns across the dangerous frontier was terrifying. "There's a man named James Caldwell," Martha replied softly. "A widower who lives near Fort Laramie. A decent soul, from what I hear. He once travelled to Bristol's Fork for supplies and helped me deliver a baby when the mother went into sudden labour at the trading post. Seek him out. He might offer shelter, no questions asked. Harriet's hands trembled as she mulled over Martha's suggestion. She had no illusions about the risk. Travelling nearly 100 miles to Fort Laramie with twin infants was daunting, especially through territory teeming with outlaws, wild animals and rough weather. But John's threats worsened by the day, and Harriet knew that if she stayed, her daughters might soon be motherless or worse. Martha devised a plan to aid Harriet's escape. She promised to slip Harriet some provisions, dried meat water skins, and a few coins, enough to get her started on the journey. Under the cover of night, they would use the midwife's small wagon to ferry Harriet and the babies safely beyond the ranch's borders, well out of John Brodie's sight. Harriet's heart pounded at the thought of leaving behind everything she knew, including Samuel. Yet in her darkest moments, she questioned his loyalty. Would he stand by while John harmed her and the twins? His silence, his impotence, spoke volumes. Harriet's maternal instincts roared. She needed to protect her daughters above all else. At dawn the next day, Harriet approached Samuel one last time, begging him to come with her. He looked torn, but fear of his father rooted him where he stood. "I can't," he whispered, tears in his eyes. Harriet saw the truth. He was a prisoner of his father's dominance, unable to break free. Sorrow flooded her, but she steeled herself. She would leave with or without him. A sliver of moon hung low in the sky as Harriet clutched her swaddled daughters and stepped into the chilly night air. The midwife, Martha, waited behind the barn, a single lantern illuminating the small wagon. Harriet's heart hammered like a war drum. Every distant rustle of grass or creak of wood made her fear that John would appear, rifle in hand. Quietly, Harriet and Martha loaded the wagon with the few supplies Harriet owned. Her threadbare clothes, a battered trunk of baby blankets, and some dried provisions. Harriet wrapped her daughters tightly, pressing soft kisses to their foreheads. She whispered promises that they would find a safe place, a new beginning. The wagon wheels groaned as Martha set them in motion, guiding the horses away from the ranch. Harriet's limbs felt numb from fear, and the night chill. But every moment that passed without a shout or gunshot from the house bolstered her hope. After what felt like an eternity, the ranch faded into darkness behind them. Harriet breathed a shaky sigh of relief, only to be met with the vast, uncharted frontier stretching out before her. She stared up at the moon, struggling to quell the panic in her chest. She was leaving behind everything familiar, yet forging a path to protect her children. If there was a spark of courage in Harriet's soul, it burned brighter now than ever before. For several days, Martha guided Harriet and the twins along winding trails away from the main roads that John Brodie might patrol. They slept in the open, huddled under a canvas sheet, with Harriet waking often to nurse the babies. Every snapping twig or coyote howl sent a jolt of dread through her, but Martha remained unwavering, her calm presence a balm in the darkest hours. Eventually they parted ways at a small crossroad. Martha had responsibilities back in Bristol's Fork, other mothers-to-be, who counted on her. With tears in her eyes, she pressed a small folded note into Harriet's hand. "If you ever find yourself in dire straits, show this to the shopkeeper at Barton's trading post near Fort Laramie. It's a recommendation for James Caldwell. He'll honor my word." Harriet hugged Martha tightly, gratitude mingling with fear of the unknown. She set out alone, the reins in her trembling hands, determined to reach Fort Laramie. During the journey, She mulled over what little she knew of James Caldwell. He was rumored to be a widower, with a quiet, steadfast demeanor. His wife had died of fever a year prior. He owned a small cabin near the fort, and occasionally hired workers, paid them fairly, and showed kindness to people passing through. That small kernel of hope was enough for Harriet to cling to as she rattled along the dusty road, 2 tiny lives depending on her. Harriet arrived at Fort Laramie after a grueling week of travel. Just outside the fort's bustling trading post, she found Barton's store, a simple wooden building that smelled of leather and tobacco. Her legs wobbled from exhaustion as she walked inside her sleeping babies, snuggled to her chest. She handed the folded note to Mr. Barton. His bushy eyebrows rose when he read Martha's recommendation, and he offered Harriet a reassuring nod. "James Caldwell ain't more than a few miles from here, ma'am," he said. "Follow the trail past the old cottonwood grove, and you'll see his cabin by the creek, with a small bag of provisions gifted by Mr. Moore." Barton Harriet steered her weary horses down the indicated path. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the cottonwoods, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Finally, she caught sight of a modest cabin nestled near the bend of a shallow creek. Smoke curled from the chimney. Harriet's heart pounded as she approached, uncertain whether James would welcome her or turn her away. She dismounted with shaking limbs, carefully lifting her daughters from the wagon. The cabin door opened, and a tall man stepped onto the porch. His brown hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and a gentle seriousness shone in his eyes. Harriet mustered her courage and introduced herself, voicing Martha's name, in hopes it would earn her a sliver of trust. James Caldwell looked at Harriet's bedraggled form and the tiny infants in her arms, then at the wagon loaded with paltry belongings. He didn't pepper her with questions, he simply opened the door wider and stood aside. "Come in," he said in a calm, steady voice. Inside the cabin was simple but warm. The hearth glowed with embers, and the aroma of stew lingering from midday drifted through the air. Harriet's nose tingled, reminding her it had been more than a day since she'd eaten anything substantial. James directed her to a small rocking chair near the fire, where she gingerly sat, and exhaled a suck she felt she'd been holding for days. "Let me put on some fresh water to boil," James offered, taking note of her hungry eyes and the babies stirring in her arms. Harriet watched as he moved with quiet efficiency, heating water and producing a clean rag to wash the infants if needed. He spoke gently, asking if the girls had names yet. Harriet hesitated, remembering John's vile commands. "I'd like to call them Mary and Martha," she said, voice trembling. James nodded and repeated their names softly, as if welcoming them to the world. In that moment, Harriet felt a fragile sense of safety. She knew she was far from truly secure. John's reach might extend beyond Bristol's Fork, but for now, huddled in James Caldwell's humble cabin, she and her daughters were sheltered from the storm. Over the following days, Harriet recovered some of her strength, helped by James's quiet kindness. He provided her with a spare cot, a few fresh blankets, and space to nurse Mary and Martha undisturbed. She noticed how he kept the place impeccably tidy, no doubt a habit from his days living with his late wife. Eventually, Harriet gathered the courage to ask him about his past. James sat on a worn wooden stool by the fireplace, gazing into the flickering flames. In a soft tone, he recalled how he and his wife Eliza had journeyed west for a fresh start. They settled near Fort Laramie, building the cabin from scratch. For a few years, they led a peaceful, hard-working life, cultivating a small garden and trading goods with travelers. But one harsh winter, Eliza fell gravely ill. James tried everything he could, fetching the town doctor cooking medicinal broths, but the fever consumed her. She died in his arms late one night. James's voice faltered. Even now, the pain clung to him, an unhealed wound. Harriet felt an ache of sympathy. She thought of the time she'd nearly lost Mary to a fever on the journey. She realized James's willingness to help a stranger likely stemmed from the deep well of empathy that grief had carved in his soul. In that shared moment of vulnerability, Harriet sensed a fragile bond forming a mutual understanding forged by loss and hardship. While Harriet settled into a tentative new routine, dark concerns gnawed at her mind. She couldn't forget John Brodie's menacing threats. He wasn't the type to let matters lie, especially when it concerned his vision of the Brodie legacy. Harriet had overheard him boast of powerful connections in towns scattered across the frontier, men who owed him favors or feared his wrath. One late afternoon, Harriet ventured outside to gather water from the creek. She found James already there, kneeling by the bank to rinse clothes. She cleared her throat. I'm worried, she admitted, her voice catching in her throat. About my in-laws. About John. Despite the bright sunlight streaming through the cottonwood branches, Harriet felt a chill, recalling the cruelty in John's eyes. James straightened up, setting the damp laundry aside. He studied Harriet's troubled expression. You're safe here for now, he replied softly. But if you believe they might come looking, we can't be too careful. He suggested they keep a watchful eye on passing strangers. Should Harriet recognize any of John's hired hands or sense any threat, they needed a plan to move on. Harriet swallowed hard, torn between gratitude for James's protection and the dread of uprooting once again. For her daughter's sake, though she'd do what was necessary, in that silent exchange by the water, both understood that Harriet's peaceful respite was conditional. The shadows of the Brodie family still loomed over her uncertain future. 16. Trouble in Town 240. Words. As the weeks passed, Harriet tried to maintain a low profile, venturing into Fort Laramie only when necessary for supplies. She cradled Mary and Martha close, scanning the faces in the bustling streets for any sign of John's men. The fort was a hub of activity. Wagon trains stopping on their way further west, soldiers patrolling merchants hawking wares. But Harriet moved quickly, seldom lingering to chat. One afternoon she overheard gossip at the general store. 2 ranch hands from Bristol's Fork were passing through boasting about John Brodie's new business arrangement with the local sheriff. They spoke loudly of John's influence, hinting that if he wanted someone found or removed, he had enough money to ensure cooperation. Harriet's stomach twisted into knots. She hurried out of the store and returned to James's cabin, breathless. That evening, over a simple supper of bread and stew, she recounted what she'd heard. James's brow furrowed. We can't stay too long in one place if that's the case, he said gravely. He had no illusions about the crookedness of some frontier sheriffs, especially those easily swayed by wealthy landowners like John Brodie. They weighed their options, debating the possibility of relocating to a more distant settlement or traveling deeper into the territory. Yet Harriet hated the thought of constant flight. Mary and Martha needed stability. Each day became a tense vigil, Harriet longing for a real home while bracing herself for the threat she feared was soon to find her. Late one evening, Harriet heard a hesitant knock on the cabin door. James moved cautiously, retrieving a rifle from beneath his cot. Harriet's heart pounded as she pressed Mary and Martha close, prepared to flee or fight. When James swung open the door, Harriet gasped to see Samuel standing there, eyes sunken with fatigue, dust clinging to his coat. She had imagined this moment countless times, never sure if Samuel would come as a friend or foe. Samuel barely managed a trembling smile. Harriet, I had to see if you were safe." Harriet's eyes glistened with tears, a whirlwind of emotions, relief, anger and sorrow churning within her. She let Samuel inside. He darted a wary glance at James, who set aside the rifle and offered a curt nod, stepping aside to give them space. Samuel explained in hushed tones that he could no longer bear the guilt. John had escalated his search, hiring men to roam the territory, showing sketches of Harriet's face. Samuel insisted he never wanted to harm her or the twins, yet he confessed that he had done little to stop John's plans. His fear had paralyzed him, but now he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent. He'd snuck away, risking John's ire, to warn Harriet that danger was imminent. Harriet listened, half wondering if it was too little too late. Their conversation lasted deep into the night. Harriet sat by the hearth, Mary and Martha sleeping in a makeshift cradle at her feet. She confronted Samuel about his inaction the nights she lay awake, terrified in the Brodie house, while he said nothing. He hung his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I failed you," he whispered. "I was too scared of my father to protect my own wife and children." He recounted how John had ranted about Harriet's disloyalty, labeling her a curse for bearing girls. He threatened to disown Samuel unless Harriet was found and dealt with. With Harriet gone, John planned to force Samuel to remarry a woman of John's choosing, ensuring a male heir for the legacy. Harriet fought back anger that flared within her. She had once loved this man deeply. Now she questioned whether love alone was enough to atone for all he hadn't done. James, who had listened in silence, finally cleared his throat. "What matters now is that Harriet and the babies are in danger," he said calmly. "We need a plan." Samuel nodded, desperation flickering in his eyes. He begged Harriet's forgiveness, promising he would face his father's wrath if it meant ensuring her safety. Harriet saw genuine remorse, but lingering doubt gnawed at her. Could Samuel stand against John's iron will, or was this a fleeting spark of courage destined to be extinguished? At dawn, Harriet felt a glimmer of hope that Samuel could help them navigate John's next move. He had knowledge of John's hired hands, the men's names, their routes, even where they might set up camp. With that information, Harriet and James could avoid them. Perhaps the trio could slip away to a safer region, leaving the spectre of John Brodie behind. But just as they started to form a plan, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping toward the cabin. James and Samuel peered through the window, grim tension crackling in the air. Harriet scooped up the twins and retreated to the bedroom, heart hammering. She listened to muffled voices at the door. Moments later, James entered the bedroom, his face grim. "It's a messenger from Barton's store. He says John's men are in the vicinity, asking about a woman with twin babies." Harriet's hands shook. The messenger reported that John had struck a deal with a crooked deputy stationed at the fort, who was only too eager to assist for a tidy sum. Harriet's days in this safe haven were numbered. They had to act fast. Harriet glanced around the small bedroom, tears threatening to spill. This was the closest thing she'd had to a home since leaving the Brodie ranch. But the West was lawless, and John's money could twist the law to his advantage. If Harriet stayed, it was only a matter of time before they broke down the door. They hurriedly packed provisions, dried meat, water canteens, a few clothes, plus the cradle and blankets for Mary and Martha. James offered to guide Harriet and the twins deeper into the territory, where John's influence might not extend so easily. Samuel insisted on coming, despite Harriet's lingering doubts. Before leaving, James scrawled a quick note, leaving it in a hidden spot for the messenger. It was a request for one of his trusted acquaintances, a traveling preacher named Reverend Lyle, to spread a false rumor that Harriet had already boarded a wagon train headed to California. The hope was to send John's men on a wild goose chase, buying Harriet precious time. With the last of their belongings secured in a second-hand wagon, James owned the group set off before sunrise. Harriet cradled Mary and Martha, the wagon jolting beneath them. Ahead, James rode his horse, scouting the trail. Samuel followed on another steed, anxious eyes, scanning the hills for any sign of pursuit. The crisp morning air felt thick with tension as they pushed further from Fort Laramie, plunging into the vast unknown. Every mile put distance between Harriet and John Brodie, but also drew them closer to the hardships of raw wilderness, uncertain shelter, uncertain survival. Yet Harriet had no choice. She would rather face the perils of the frontier than return to the hands of her vengeful in-laws. They traveled for 3 days without incident, stopping briefly to rest the horses and set up crude campsites at night. James quietly took charge, using his knowledge of the terrain to find secluded spots. He rarely spoke of Eliza, but Harriet noticed how he sometimes gazed at Mary and Martha with a distant sadness, perhaps remembering the children he'd never had. On the 4th afternoon they stumbled upon trouble. As they neared a rocky pass, 4 armed men on horseback blocked their path. Harriet's heart leapt into her throat when she recognized the Brodie Ranch brand on one rider's saddle. John's men. The leader, a burly, bearded man named Fitch, sneered. "Mr. Brodie wants his property back," he spat, nodding toward Harriet. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." James maintained a stoic exterior, but Harriet saw tension in his jaw. He rested one hand on his holstered revolver. Samuel swallowed hard, gripping the reins. Harriet clutched the infants protectively. "Harriet ain't property," James said evenly. "You boys stand down." Fitch laughed cruelly. "We got orders. She's coming with us, or things get ugly." He signaled to the other riders who spread out menacingly. Harriet's pulse pounded. She feared for Mary and Martha. Time seemed to stall as Fitch reached for his gun. Samuel jerked in alarm. Then a shot rang out. James had fired a warning round into the air. Chaos erupted under the blood-red glow of the setting sun. At the echo of the gunshot, Fitch's men spurred their horses. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. Bullets whizzed past the wagon, splintering wood and kicking up dust. Harriet shrank back, shielding the crying twins beneath her cloak. James returned fire with cold precision, forcing Fitch and another rider to veer sharply away. One bullet struck the rocky ground just inches from Harriet's feet, spraying her with shards of stone. Samuel, eyes wild, drew his revolver and managed a clumsy shot that startled one of the attackers, sending him tumbling from his saddle. While the assailants regrouped, James shouted, "I'm armed. Get out of here." Harriet seized the reins of the wagon, lashing them with trembling hands. The startled horses bolted forward, nearly toppling the wagon on the rough terrain. Samuel galloped alongside, trying to keep the wagon from swerving. James remained behind for a few critical seconds, returning fire to keep Fitch's men pinned down. Only when Harriet and Samuel had gained some distance did he whirl his horse around and race to catch up the sound of his mount's hooves, pounding like a furious drumbeat. Bullets continued to crack through the air, but Harriet didn't dare look back. Her only thought was to keep the twins safe. She prayed that the uncertain path ahead would lead them far from John Brodie's reach. Adrenaline coursed through her as the wagon rattled into the twilight, the setting sun painting the sky in desperate shades of orange and crimson. Long after the sun dipped below the horizon, they found refuge in a narrow canyon where towering walls of rock provided some cover. Harriet's hands shook as she applied a soothing salve to Martha's reddened cheeks, the infant still wailing from the terrifying ordeal. Mary clung to Harriet's dress, her wide eyes reflecting the flicker of their campfire. James arrived last, guiding his horse slowly into the canyon. "We lost them for now," he reported, breath-labored. Samuel slumped against a rock, managed a weary nod. He had grazed his leg against the saddle during the chase, leaving it bruised and throbbing. They lit a small fire and huddled around it. A grim silence settled as each tried to process the violent ambush. Harriet looked between Samuel and James, gratitude and fear colliding in her chest. Without their intervention, she would have surely been dragged back to John by now. "We can't keep running like this," Harriet murmured, swallowing hard. "Where can we go that John and his men won't follow?" James exchanged a glance with Samuel, then said quietly, "There's a mining settlement deeper south near the foothills. Rough country, but new people come and go all the time. It's called Grayson Gulch. We might be able to blend in, find work or shelter." Harriet nodded, realizing how few choices they had left. She resolved to do whatever it took to protect her daughters, even if it meant venturing into the harsh unknown of Grayson Gulch. Dawn broke over the canyon walls, painting them in pale gold. With the lingering tension from last night's ambush, they set out again, winding through hidden trails and rocky passes. It was a grueling journey, especially with 2 infants to care for. Harriet nursed them whenever they stopped to rest, the horse's exhaustion etched into her very bones. After several days, the rocky terrain gradually gave way to rolling foothills. Miners' shanties and tents appeared along the rough paths, evidence of a gold rush that had drawn fortune hunters to Grayson Gulch. Entering the settlement, Harriet was struck by the mix of desperation and hope in the air. Ramshackle saloons, makeshift shops, and rickety cabins formed a patchwork of dwellings swarming with prospectors covered in dust. James led them to a dingy but passable boarding house. The landlady, a pragmatic woman named Agatha, looked them over with a raised brow. "We don't get many families here," she remarked, eyeing the crying babies. But after accepting payment, nearly all the coins they had left, she showed them to 2 cramped rooms, smelling of must and stale air. Samuel ventured out to buy supplies and scout for any sign of John's men. Harriet sensed his renewed determination, yet she also noticed a haunted look in his eyes, as though guilt and fear still wrestled inside him. Meanwhile, James busied himself with ensuring the wagon and horses were kept discreet away from prying eyes. Harriet prayed they might find a moment's respite in Grayson Gulch, if only to catch their breaths before danger closed in again. Harriet settled on the boarding house's creaking porch, letting Mary and Martha doze in a small wicker cradle. With a weary sigh, she gazed out at the dusty street where wagons rattled by and laborers lugged sacks of mining ore. It was a harsh life, but at least she was momentarily free from the immediate threat of John Brodie's men. The respite was short-lived. As Harriet rocked the cradle with a trembling foot, she noticed a lone rider approaching. Her pulse spiked when she recognized Fitch, the same burly henchman from the ambush leading his horse slowly through the crowded street. He didn't appear to see her yet, but Harriet's heart pounded. How had he tracked them here desperate? Harriet grabbed the cradle, tiptoeing inside to warn James. She found him in the narrow corridor, rummaging through his pack. "Fitch is here," she hissed, voice quavering. James stiffened. They hurried to find Samuel, but he was nowhere to be seen. With no time to lose, Harriet and James hurried out a back entrance. They circled behind the boarding house, scanning the street. Fitch was dismounting at the local saloon, presumably to ask questions or sniff out clues. Harriet and James locked eyes. The precarious refuge they'd sought in Grayson Gulch was already compromised. If Fitch discovered them, Harriet knew the next confrontation might end in bloodshed. For a moment, Harriet felt overwhelmed by hopelessness, but she steeled herself. She refused to let her daughters fall into John Brody's clutches. Not after coming so far. Slipping into the shadows behind the saloon, James and Harriet debated their next move. Leaving town immediately seemed prudent, but Samuel was still missing, and the twins needed rest. Harriet's maternal instinct flared. She couldn't keep dragging Mary and Martha from one place to another without end. Sooner or later, they'd be cornered. Perhaps she thought it was time to stand their ground. James studied her determined expression and gave a slight nod. "We could confront Fitch on our terms," he suggested. "If they could incapacitate or drive him off, maybe they'd buy themselves enough time to secure some measure of stability." They retreated to the boarding house. James fetched his rifle and quietly checked the ammunition. Harriet, though trembling, helped him strategize. She would wait upstairs with the twins out of immediate danger. If Fitch or his men came in, shooting James would have the advantage of high ground from the second-story windows. Minutes later, the front door burst open. Agatha shrieked as Fitch and another Brody ranch hand stormed inside, demanding Harriet's whereabouts. James, concealed behind the banister on the upper floor, responded with a steely voice, "Leave now, Fitch. This doesn't concern you." A tense standoff ensued in the dimly lit corridor. Harriet, peeking through a crack in the bedroom door, clutched the twins. She prayed James's plan would work, and that no innocent souls would be harmed. The moment of reckoning with John Brody's enforcer had finally arrived. Fitch sneered, revolver clenched in his thick fist. "Don't be a fool, Caldwell," he growled. "This is business between the Brody family and that runaway wife. Hand her over." James kept his rifle trained unwavering. "Harriet's not property," he said coldly. "You won't take her." A savage grin twisted Fitch's lips. He raised his revolver, opening fire. Bullets shattered plaster, sending Agatha scuttling for cover. James returned fire with precision, forcing Fitch and his companion to dive behind a wooden table. Sawdust and splinters filled the air as lead tore through the rickety boarding house walls. Harriet clapped her hands over her ears, heart pounding. Mary and Martha shrieked in terror. She cursed John Brody for unleashing this nightmare. Glancing down at her daughters, Harriet felt fury rise in her throat. She refused to cower forever. Summoning courage, Harriet stepped onto the hallway, landing the babies hidden safely in the bedroom behind a makeshift barricade. She raised a trembling pistol, a small one James had given her days ago, just in case. Spotting Fitch's broad back, Harriet squeezed the trigger. The shot grazed his arm, drawing a howl of rage. Fitch's wild eyes locked on Harriet. He lurched forward, brandishing his revolver, but a second shot rang out. James's bullet struck Fitch in the chest. The man staggered, dropping his gun. A crimson stain spread across his shirt as he collapsed, gasping. His companion fled out the door, footsteps pounding. In a swirl of dust and gun smoke, Fitch breathed his last victim of his own merciless pursuit. In the aftermath, the boarding house was chaos. Agatha and a few other lodgers emerged ashen-faced. Harriet clutched the stair rail, nearly sinking to her knees. She felt relief that James was unhurt, yet horror at the sight of the lifeless Fitch. This was the result of John Brody's relentless vendetta. How many more men would die for his twisted pride? Suddenly, Samuel burst in, panting, a cut on his forehead. He froze upon seeing Fitch's body, sprawled on the floor. Turning to Harriet, tears filled his eyes. "I just learned Pa's on his way," he said breathlessly. "He's been riding day and night, heading here with more men." James exchanged a grim look with Harriet. One henchman dead, another escaped. Surely word would reach John quickly. Harriet felt a pang of dread. They could no longer hide. The next confrontation might be with John Brodie himself. Samuel's voice wavered as he spoke. "I have to face him. It's the only way." He explained that if he stood up to John, publicly refuting his father's claim that Harriet belonged to the Brodie ranch, perhaps the townsfolk or local authorities wouldn't assist John. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking. "I should have done this from the start." Harriet gazed into Samuel's anguished face. She thought of the nights she wept alone, the terror she endured. But the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. With John close behind, they had little choice. Harriet nodded slowly. They would prepare for a final showdown. Word spread quickly that John Brodie and his riders would arrive in Grayson Gulch by midday. The dusty streets filled with nervous whispers. Agatha locked the boarding house, refusing to let it become a battleground. Instead, Harriet, James, and Samuel took up positions along a wide stretch of the main road. Harriet's palms were slick with sweat as she cradled the twins in a safe corner near a stable, flanked by a few sympathetic townsfolk who agreed to protect her. High noon approached. Sunlight glared off broken windows. James and Samuel stood side by side, rifles in hand, scanning the horizon. At last, a column of riders appeared. John Brodie at the forefront, his expression carved from granite. He pulled his horse to a stop about 50 paces from Samuel. "You have some nerve!" Boy John snarled, eyes burning with contempt. "Siding with that woman and the worthless brats she birthed." "I gave you life. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me." Samuel's voice trembled, but remained firm. "I've let you control me too long, Pa. Harriet is my wife, my family. I won't let you kill her just because she had girls." John spat in the dust. "Then you're no son of mine." Raising his rifle, he aimed at Samuel with deadly intent. Townsfolk cried out, stumbling back. But before John could pull the trigger, James stepped forward. "That's enough," James roared. Tension crackled in the sweltering air. The final reckoning had begun. In a single heart-stopping moment, a volley of shots rang out. Samuel flung himself to the side. James fired at a rider who veered toward Harriet's hiding spot, downing him instantly. John, consumed by fury, squeezed off a round that caught Samuel's shoulder, sending him crashing to the dirt. Harriet screamed, but John's triumph was short-lived. James shifted his aim and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck John squarely in the chest. The old man dropped from his saddle, eyes wide with shock, as if he couldn't fathom his own mortality. Dust billowed around him as he hit the ground, lifeless. The remaining riders, seeing their employer fall, quickly lost their will to fight. They spurred their horses and fled, leaving John Brodie's body behind in the dust of Grayson Gulch. Harriet rushed to Samuel's side, tears streaking her cheeks. Though wounded, he was alive. Townspeople emerged from doorways and alleys, muttering about the drama that had just unfolded. A doctor was summoned to tend to Samuel's injury. James placed a comforting hand on Harriet's shoulder. In that dusty street, Harriet understood they were finally free. John's iron grip had fallen away, and with it, the fear that had stalked her every step. She cradled Mary and Martha, close pressing soft kisses to their heads. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, Harriet believed they could build a life, one not dictated by tyranny or the demand for a male heir. They had survived, and now it was time to truly live. From that day forward, Harriet never again bowed to anyone's demands. Samuel's shoulder healed, and with time he found a measure of forgiveness in Harriet's heart, though their paths diverged. He left to make his own way, determined to become a better man, apart from his father's legacy. Harriet chose to remain with James Caldwell, whose steadfast courage and quiet kindness had saved her life more times than she could count. Together they built a homestead near Grayson Gulch, raising Mary and Martha in a household of respect and love. Their story stands as a testament to resilience, that no matter how harsh the frontier or how domineering one's family, the human spirit can prevail. Now, dear listener, if this Wild West tale of bravery, heartbreak, and redemption moved you in any way, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories alive, echoing through the dusty trails of history and imagination. Thank you for joining us on this journey.